Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for coming to this annual membership renewal and new member welcome gathering. We're very pleased to have you here. Some of us had a nice socializing time with some very good food. And so that was a nice prelude to our program now. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to call on someone else who has a very important message for you, and that is our donor drive chair, the Reverend Carol Haig. She's going to talk to you a little bit about what you might do with those envelopes that are on your seat. Carol.
But first and foremost, I want to respect that this is the membership renewal event. And I really want to honor, first of all, any new members. So hold up your hands and let me give you a flower. Who's a new member?
Yes,
oh,
there's
right.
some.
This for the man in the back row. I'm going to drip a little water on you. I don't know. Who else is a new member? New member. All right. And another one.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Right, you can spread out the colors as much as I can. You a new member with you? She's not. Then you get two.
Real friend here.
This is a new
First ever
member.
meeting as well.
All right. This is a new member today. However, I bet a bunch of you renewed. You've been members before and you knew you were coming to this and you renewed your membership. Who might that be? There's Catherine. This is back to Catherine. Who else renewed because they were coming today? Here you are. Okay. This is going to happen. Who else is a renewed member? A long-time member, but coming back today. And somebody else. Here we go. I'm trying not to drip water on people. Another renewed member. All right, give that to that. Yeah?
He's going to look spiffy.
Like this. Very nice. You see, it doesn't work to just be a member once. You've got to be a member again. Anybody else is a renewed member. Now, I have a lot of flowers left, so I would like to find out who's been a member here the longest. Has anybody been a member for 10 years? Oh. Has anybody been a member for 15 years? Wow. How about 20 years? 25 years? There's a bunch of them. 30? Anybody member for 30 years? 40 years? Wow. Although Frank up there, you got one. Frank gets one. And I'm going to leave the rest of these here in the spirit of spring and warmth and loveliness. We need a lot of this right now. Fortunately, they didn't take them for the lunch. So I also want to invite you to consider, probably everybody here has given money to the coalition at some time or another, but you are either sitting on or smartly got it out from under you, an envelope. We would love to have additional support. At this time, as Bob will tell you all the details that I'm not so smart about, our efforts to work on nuclear disarmament are hugely, hugely important right now. And every little bit helps. And so if you've been a member and you've paid your membership and would like to add a little more, that's wonderful. If you're already a donor and want to give again, that's wonderful. And we have someone who's offered a match. And anybody who gives money up to, not an individual, but collectively up to $2,000, we will have that matched. So if you write a check for 10, Coalition gets 10. If you write it for 100, we get 200. So I invite you to do that. There are probably pens. I see somebody using one.
Yes.
Jen has extra pens. Raise your hand if you need a pen.
Can we pay online?
Okay, I don't understand about that.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
If you have your mobile device, just go and it's at the top right of the website.
Pay online.
Donate button.
Wonderful. Okay. And welcome. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you very much. And again, if you do need a pen to fill out your form, that would be great. And just raise your hand and Jen will get a pen to you. This event we've been doing since about 2010. And so it's geared specifically toward members that are existing members that we're encouraging to renew, but it's also geared toward new members. And so I'm happy to see both categories are represented here. On your form, I do want to point out that you can do it online, as we were just asked, at peacecoalition.org, and you click on the button on the top right that says Donate, and that'll let you make your gift online. But even if you're making your gift today using that envelope, you have several options. You have the option of writing a check. If you're doing it that way, you want to make a check could be tax deductible if you make it to the Peace Action Education Fund, or you can use the acronym PAEF, or make it to the regular coalition. The advantage of that second option is that we can use that for our lobbying and advocacy work. We're not allowed to use the Ed Fund's money for those kinds of things. And so you can write a check, or you could, if you have your credit card with you, you can just record your credit card information on that, seal it, and then when we collect them at the end, we're all set. And then, of course, there's always cash. We're willing to accept cash, too. So isn't that wonderful? So again, thank you for being here. We really appreciate your support. And I think we're going to have a terrific presentation this afternoon. So I'm honored now to turn to introducing our keynote speaker. Dr. Helfand, Dr. Ira Helfand, is very special. He's a physician, that's the kind of doctorate he has. And he has been a leader of two organizations that have received the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1985, he was the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which Dr. Helfand was then the president of, I believe. They got the Nobel Peace Prize. And then, more recently in 2017, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, I hope many of you have heard of that, ICAN, which Dr. Helfand is on their board, got the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's a very deeply steeped person who knows a lot about these issues. He caught my attention. I've known Dr. Helfand for some time, but he caught my attention not too long ago in the New York Times, when the New York Times has been doing a series of At the Brink. Some of you may be aware of that. And largely, those are very good articles that they've done. However, in one of the articles, not too long ago, the assertion was made that, well, of course we need to have nuclear deterrence in place. That's the way we can prevent the use of nuclear weapons, with nuclear deterrence. Dr. Helfand wrote the lead letter to the editor shortly after that was published in the New York Times, challenging that assumption. And yes, amen to that, challenging it, because it needs to be challenged. And that's why I was intrigued, and I said, wouldn't it be great? And we were so fortunate to get his acceptance if he would come and speak on that for us. So the title of his talk is The Myth of Nuclear Deterrence. Let's welcome Dr. Ira Helfand.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I know that this is an annual event, but I also know that you know from the topic that this is going to be a fairly difficult conversation we're about to have, and I appreciate you being willing to be part of it. Deterrence is a myth. We have all been taught repeatedly, consistently, for decades, that there is something magical about nuclear weapons that guarantees they'll never be used. And it's extraordinary because this really is just magical thinking. It's this idea that there's this mysterious power that nuclear weapons have. There's a kernel of truth in the argument. They're horrible, and no rational person would ever use them deliberately. But that doesn't guarantee they won't be used. And in fact, we know of many, many occasions when we have come perilously close to their being used, to nuclear war. And so we need to take this issue of deterrence head on and appreciate the enormous hold it has not just on the public, but also on our leadership. When you talk about deterrence in Washington, you know, it's as if you're questioning the foundations of the republic or some fundamental religious dogma. Deterrence, how can you talk about undermining deterrence? We need this. We need to get people to understand the real situation, which is that nuclear weapons do not have a magical power that guarantees they'll never be used. I think there are three messages that we need to bring to the public. One, people need to understand that nuclear war really can happen, that deterrence is a myth. Secondly, they need to understand that if it does happen, it is going to be more catastrophic than they can possibly imagine. And third, they need to understand it doesn't have to happen. This is not predestined. Nuclear war is not something which we are doomed to experience. We may well have one if we don't start acting very differently, but it doesn't have to happen. So let me start by talking about why I think that we are closer to nuclear war than we've ever been. This is not an assessment that I put forward. This is the assessment that William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, put forward in 2018. And he put this forward largely in the context of the deterioration in U.S.-Russian relations that was evident even then. This was 4 years before the second Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, with that invasion, with the repeated explicit threats by Russia to use nuclear weapons, the danger of nuclear war has gotten dramatically worse even than it was in 2018. So that was the first that I was aware of enunciation of this new idea that things are even worse than during the Cold War. And I think we need to understand that it's not just the US-Russia situation that brings us close to the brink of nuclear war. There are several other geopolitical flashpoints that need to be considered as well. US-Chinese relations are the worst they have been since the 1970s. We are probably on a collision course with China. There are people like Michael Clare at The Nation who believe firmly that there is a war party in both Beijing and Washington that has concluded in each case that war is inevitable between the United States and China, and that believes that the two respective militaries need to be preparing to win that war, not to avoid it. The flashpoint could be over Taiwan, it could be over shipping in the South China Sea. It is an extreme danger, and if there's a war between the United States and China, it is very hard to imagine how this would not escalate rapidly to nuclear conflict. There's a situation in Korea. This was dramatically thrust to our attention in 2017 during the first Trump administration with the insults and threats traded between Trump and Kim over who had the bigger button, who was going to cause more fire and fury, and so on. It seemed to quiet down with the negotiations in Singapore and Hanoi, but those negotiations failed, and actually, as a result of them, the situation is probably worse than it was before they began, because the North Koreans appear to have drawn the conclusion that the U.S. is absolutely committed to forcing them to get rid of their nuclear weapons, and is not serious about negotiating a reasonable agreement. And certainly since then, the North Koreans have moved ahead very rapidly with both their nuclear and their missile programs. Then there is the situation in the Middle East, which until recently did not really seem to have that much of a nuclear dimension, but now it seems that it does. The Iranians are very close to getting a nuclear weapon if they choose to. The Israelis already have nuclear weapons. The US has just put 6 B-2 bombers in Diego Garcia within range to attack Iran. We don't know what form that attack will take if in fact it happens, but the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons in the Middle East really has to be considered a real threat as well. And finally, there's a situation in South Asia, which I frankly think is the most dangerous of all. India and Pakistan have gone to war 4 times in the last 80 years. They almost went to war again in 2019. If they go to war again, it almost certainly will be a nuclear war. There is fighting on the border between India and Pakistan in Kashmir on an almost daily basis. It's very low level. It's mainly performative. You know, one side or the other launches a couple of mortar shells into the other side just to sort of make the point that we're here. But this could easily escalate, as it almost did in 2019, into a large-scale war. If that happens, India has enormous conventional superiority over Pakistan. And in response to that, the Pakistanis have clearly articulated a military doctrine. If Indian conventional military forces cross into Pakistan, they will be met on the battlefield with tactical nuclear weapons. And in response to that, India has clearly stated that if that happens, India will attack Pakistani cities in retaliation. So, I mean, this is a powder keg that just needs to have somebody drop a match on it. And it's an extraordinarily dangerous situation. In addition to these 5 potential geopolitical flashpoints, there are 3 other factors which I think we need to consider, which are all driving us closer to the brink of nuclear war. Excuse me. First of these is the climate crisis. And people don't always think of the climate crisis and nuclear war, this connection in this way. But there's a very powerful connection between them. All 9 of the nuclear weapon states claim that it is their policy eventually to get rid of their nuclear weapons in the future when the world is safer. The problem is the world isn't getting safer, it's getting more dangerous. And it's the climate crisis really that's driving this. There are already areas of the world which, because of the climate crisis, are unable to feed their current population. And as the climate crisis unfolds over the coming decades, and it will, even if we do all the things that we're supposed to do to try to mitigate that, this situation is going to get worse. There will be intense conflict within societies as people fight over scarce resources of food and water. There will be conflicts between nations as they fight over scarce resources of food and water. There will be migration on a scale we have never seen in human history. And all of these things are going to increase the potential for a confrontation that escalates to nuclear weapons if they are still on the table as this conflict unfolds. The second of these non-geopolitical factors relates to the evolution of cyber technology. We used to think that the worst thing that a terrorist group could do with regards to nuclear weapons would be to get hold of probably 1 or 2, probably relatively small nuclear warheads from the arsenals of one of the countries which possess them, and use that warhead or those warheads to attack a city, New York or Moscow or Mumbai or Tel Aviv. That could still happen. But we now understand that's not the greatest threat. The greater threat is that terrorists, or possibly a criminal organization or a state actor actually, could hack into the command and control systems of a nuclear weapon state and actually launch that country's nuclear weapons directly, or at the very least create a false alert, convince the country that's being hacked that a nuclear attack has been launched against it, and trick it into launching a retaliatory attack against this attack which doesn't actually exist. This is an absolute nightmare scenario. We know that US military computers are breached hundreds of times every day. When it comes to cyber warfare, the offense always has the advantage because the defense doesn't know what form the attack will take. And it really is quite remarkable and quite fortunate that so far we have not had, that we know of, a breach of nuclear command and control systems. This whole problem gets even worse when you add into the mix the possible mating of artificial intelligence devices to nuclear command and control systems. And our organization, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, held a really extraordinarily important webinar in January, which is available on our website, about the danger of mating AI with nuclear command and control. The final factor that we need to consider needs a little disclaimer before I get into it. This is not a partisan statement. We have a problem with Donald Trump being president of the United States. He has demonstrated this week a profound lack of judgment, and almost, if it weren't so tragic, comical incompetence. And the fact that he is in charge of a nuclear arsenal should give pause to everybody on the planet. And I think it probably is to many people who think about this. So that's the final risk factor that I would add to the mix. For all of these reasons, we have to understand that much as we would like to believe that nuclear war was a problem that people worried about in the 1980s that we don't need to care about anymore, that simply isn't true. Nuclear war is a real and present danger, and I would argue that if we do not change our action, this is not just something which can happen, but something which will happen. We have been extraordinarily lucky for 80 years. We are told that we have avoided nuclear war because of deterrence. A more accurate analysis, I think, was offered by former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. He was talking specifically about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what he said was, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. It's not because we have wise leaders. It's not because we have perfect technology. It's not because we have sound military doctrines. It's because we have been inordinately lucky. So, given that, let's consider for a few minutes what's going to happen if there is a nuclear war. And I suspect that all of you know what I'm going to talk about at some level. We all used to know this intimately back in the 1980s, and looking at this crowd, most of us were involved back in the 1980s. We all used to understand this. We were terrified of nuclear war. There were movies about nuclear war, there were books about nuclear war, we had nightmares about nuclear war. We got it. We knew what was going to happen. Well, people of our age have basically forgotten this, by and large. And young people have never been taught this. The ignorance among intelligent, well-educated young people on this subject is astonishing. They simply have never been exposed to this information. And it's important that they do be exposed because the ideas they have, and perhaps the ideas which we now have come to, are really very, very inaccurate. Young people think that nuclear war is going to be like Hiroshima. They've seen the pictures. This is a horrifying thing. You look at the devastation at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It's a terrible warning about what nuclear weapons can do. But what we need to understand is that this does not begin to prepare us for what a modern nuclear war will look like. If the United States and Russia go to war, it's not going to be one Hiroshima-sized bomb on one or two cities. It's going to be many bombs on many cities. The Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. Most of the bombs in the US and Russian arsenal today are 100 to 800 kilotons. There are some that are even larger than that. 6 to 50 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either the United States or Russia, but people who had access to classified information, like our late colleague Bruce Blair, said that was his belief, and I see no reason to doubt this, that a major target city, like New York or Washington or Philadelphia, is probably targeted with anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15, maybe more nuclear warheads. Bruce told me in 2017 at a meeting that Alan Robach attended with me, that at that time, I think it was 17-16, the US was targeting Moscow with 100 nuclear warheads, down from the 400 nuclear warheads we had targeted on the city during the Cold War. So 10 to 15 warheads, each 60 to 50 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. It's very hard for me to describe to you what that looks like or for you to get the picture. I'm going to use a model. I'm going to use a model of a very large explosion, 20 megatons, 20 million tons of TNT. We actually used to have weapons that large in the US arsenal. We don't anymore because we've figured out that you cause more damage if you use many smaller warheads and spread them out over the whole city. So this model perhaps overestimates the total megatonnage, the total explosive force that would be directed at a modern city. The destruction I will describe to you is actually something of an underestimate because you cause more damage if you use many smaller warheads and spread them out over the area you're trying to destroy. But I think the model serves a useful function because it lets us get a handle on this. It lets us imagine what this would look like. And that's really important. We need to be able to imagine this. We have enormous difficulty grasping the reality of the danger we're facing, and we need to be able to somehow figure out how to do that. So let me describe how this model would work. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this device, a fireball would form reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within that area, everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy essentially anything that human beings can build. This structure, you wouldn't find a trace of it. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, plastic, wood, gasoline, heating oil, it would all ignite. And you would get hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, or Moscow, or Beijing, we're talking about something in the order of 12 to 15 million people dead in a half an hour. And if this were part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this kind of destruction would take place in every major city in both countries. And if NATO were involved in the conflict, most of the great cities in Europe and Canada as well. All told, perhaps 200 to 300, possibly 400 million people dead in an afternoon. And those who survived this first wave of explosions and fires in the countries that fought this war would find themselves in a world which we cannot imagine. None of the things which we require to keep ourselves alive would be available. There'd be no electric grid. There'd be no internet. There'd be no cell phones. There'd be no ATMs. There'd be no food distribution system. There'd be no healthcare system. There'd be no law and order. And in the months following this war, the vast majority of the people in the country that fought that war, who did not die on the first day, would also succumb. They would die from radiation poisoning, from epidemic disease, from exposure, from starvation. And this is only part of the story, because I've only talked so far about what happens in the countries that fight the war. But this conflict would be a catastrophe for the entire planet, because these huge firestorms would put enormous amounts of soot into the upper atmosphere. Thanks to the work of Alan Roebuck and his colleagues, we estimate that a war between the United States and Russia would put 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun across the entire planet and dropping the average temperature 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And these conditions would persist over the course of a decade. We have not seen conditions on this planet that cold since the last ice age. And under these conditions, all of the ecosystems which have evolved since the end of that ice age would collapse. Food production across the entire planet would essentially stop. And according to a study that Alan and his colleagues published in August of 2022, 3/4 of the human race, under current population 6 billion people, would starve to death in the first 2 years after this war. The study only went out for 2 years. The famine would continue, and we don't know what the ultimate death toll would be. It is possible under these conditions that we would become extinct as a species. That same study also looked at a much more limited war scenario, a series of them that might take place between India and Pakistan, and found that in a war in South Asia that involved 250 of the more than 350 nuclear warheads currently on the subcontinent, that war would also be catastrophic for South Asia, where 100 million people would die in the immediate after effects of the war, and for the entire planet. Enough soot would be put into the upper atmosphere to cause global climate disruption also, as with a larger war. It wouldn't be quite as severe. The resulting famine wouldn't be quite as severe. Only a quarter of humanity, 2 billion people, would die, including 130 million people here in the United States. Even this scenario is the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in human history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there is no reason to believe that the very fragile, interconnected economic system that we all depend on could survive. So, this is the danger that we're facing. And I think it's important to understand that this is not like a scenario of a movie. This is not a story I've made up to scare you this afternoon. This is the danger that we live with every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. We know of at least 6 occasions during the nuclear weapons era when either Moscow or Washington has begun the preparation to launch its nuclear arsenal. On several of these occasions, the airplanes were put in the air and the covers were taken off the missile silos. We lucked out. The current policy of all of the nuclear weapon states is nothing more than a hope for continued, perpetual, perfect good luck. And this is an insane basis for policy. So, that's the bad news. And there's plenty of it. There is good news. And the good news is this. This is the future that will be if we don't take action. But it is not the future that must be. Nuclear weapons, although we're sometimes taught to think of them as an immutable fact of the world, they're not a force of nature. It's not as though an asteroid is coming at the planet and there's nothing we can do about it. We have made these weapons with our own hands. They are little machines. They're about the size of the chairs, most of the warheads that you're sitting in. We've dismantled 50,000 of them already. We know exactly how to do it. And dismantling the 12,000 that remain in the world would probably take about 3 or 4 years once the decision were made to do that. What is lacking is the political will to move in that direction. The countries which have nuclear weapons want to hold on to their arsenals. They want to hold on to them because these weapons give them strength. They let them bully the rest of the world. They let them get what they want. We've seen this most clearly with the Russian behavior in Ukraine, where the world has not come to the defense of Ukraine to the degree it would have otherwise because of these repeated threats of nuclear war. The US did the exact same thing during its invasion of Iraq in 2003. These weapons make countries strong, the countries that have them. And that strength is very seductive. It's like the ring of power in The Lord of the Ring. Once people have it, they don't want to give it up. We are told that they also make us safe because of deterrence. And that's the myth. They make us strong, but they don't make us safe. And they are, in fact, the greatest threat to our safety. And this is a terribly important point. It's somewhat counterintuitive. Throughout most of human history, if you had stronger weapons than your opponent, you probably were safer. And I think we feel this in our personal life. I mean, if you imagine yourself walking down a street and it's dark and somebody's walking at you and they're carrying a stick and you've got a much bigger stick, you feel safer. The problem is, if the stick is going to explode when you use it, if it is a suicide weapon, then you're not safer. And that's the reality that we live in, and we don't recognize it adequately. But we need to create that understanding. So, is it possible to bring about change in policy? I think we absolutely can say yes to that question for 2 reasons. One, because of the progress that we've made in the last decade, where there's been an international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons that was established in order to bring about a treaty that bans these weapons, and which succeeded. The ICAM was founded in 2007. 10 years later, in 2017, it had successfully mobilized public opinion and government forces in many countries to the point where the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted at the UN by a vote of 121 to 1. That treaty entered into force in 2021 when the 50th country ratified it, and we're now up to 70 countries that have ratified and close to 100 that have signed. This has been a huge change in the international conversation about nuclear weapons, but it's only gone so far, because the 9 countries which have these weapons are not party to the treaty. And that needs now to become the focus of all of our activity, but particularly for those of us who live in the United States. Because of the 3 great nuclear powers, the United States, Russia, and China, this is the only country which, at least for the moment, still has an open society where citizens, like ordinary people like us, can have some impact on the decisions that our government makes. In recognition of that, in 2017, when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was signed, we started a campaign here in the United States called Back from the Brink. It was modeled on the Freeze campaign of the 1980s, which many of you may remember, in that we created a prescription of what U.S. nuclear policy ought to be, and went about the process of getting communities all around the country to endorse this platform, in the belief that if enough people endorsed it, we would essentially be creating a national consensus that this is what U.S. government policy should be, and would be in a position, therefore, to bring real pressure, real political power to bear in Washington and change U.S. policy. The campaign has been, I think, quite successful, not nearly as successful as it needs to be, but it has seen really significant progress. It has now been joined by 490 organizations around the country, including most of the major national faith communities, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Congregational Church, the Unitarian Church, the Reconstructionist Jewish movement, Soka Gakkai in the Buddhist community, Pax Christi in the Catholic community, the Islamic Society of North America, the National Baptist Convention. They've all joined this campaign. Many leading environmental groups, the Sierra Club, the NRDC, 350.org, have joined this campaign. We have now gotten the endorsement of our first labor unions, which I think is an enormously important breakthrough. 4 unions have endorsed the campaign, and they have set about trying to get other unions on board as well. And in the last year, we have seen the formation of a student organization, Students for Nuclear Disarmament, which now has a presence on 10 campuses around the country, and which has also joined this campaign. We've gotten resolutions passed in more than 70 cities around the country, including some of the largest: Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Des Moines. We have gotten resolutions passed in a number of state legislatures. Here in New Jersey, the New Jersey Assembly has passed a resolution supporting this campaign. Both houses of the legislature in Oregon, California, and Rhode Island have passed resolutions. The Maine Senate has passed a resolution. There are resolutions pending in the Maryland legislature, the Massachusetts legislature, and the Connecticut legislature. We have a resolution in Congress. In the last session, that resolution ended up with 45 co-sponsors, which is a very significant number at this point for something dealing with the elimination of nuclear weapons. A new resolution will be introduced sometime in the next week or 2. It is a better resolution, it's a stronger resolution, and it already has 9 co-sponsors, even though it hasn't been introduced yet. So there is solid evidence that we can build a movement in this country, and that we need to follow up on that and expand this movement as rapidly as we can. I said before there are 2 reasons why I think we can say with some certainty that we can do this. One is the recent history that I've just been talking about, but the other is the history of the 1980s. In 1983, the United States deployed Pershing missiles in Europe with the explicit intention of being able to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. This was stated publicly as U.S. policy. It was a totally insane proposition that you could fight and win a nuclear war, but it was U.S. policy at the time. Less than 2 years after the deployment of those weapons, Gorbachev and Reagan sat down together and jointly said, nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. It was a complete 180-degree change in the nuclear policy of both countries. It didn't call for the elimination of the arsenals completely, but it ended the Cold War arms race, led to the marked reductions in nuclear weapons which we have seen since. That didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because millions of people in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, in Australia, even in the Soviet Union, demanded that their governments recognize the truth about nuclear weapons, that they don't make us safe, that they threaten our existence and they must be eliminated. So we have done this once already. We have brought about fundamental change in U.S. nuclear policy. All we are telling ourselves we need to do now is something that we have already done once. And I think we can and should take great comfort and inspiration from that past victory. It tells us a lot about what we can do today. I'm almost done. I just want to share two thoughts with you, two observations. One is this. The threat of nuclear war and our responsibility to do something about it is a terrible burden that we all bear. If you know that the world is at risk and you can do something about it, there is a responsibility to act. And I think those of us who all of you are included in this, who know about this problem, feel that responsibility, and it's not very pleasant to have that on your shoulders. I think, though, that we need to look at the situation from a slightly different perspective. Every one of us wants to do something good with his or her life. We all want our lives to matter. Those of us living today have been given the opportunity, literally, to save the world. And there is nothing better than anyone can ever do with his or her life. So I hope we can all carry on this work in that spirit, with the understanding that we are in a position to do something absolutely wonderful and important. No one of us is going to do this alone. No one of us is expected to do this alone. But each one of us has to do that part of the job which is ours to do. And if we do, I am optimistic and confident that we will be successful, as we were in the 1980s. And that someday, and I don't think it's going to be in the distant future, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, we're going to be able to look in the mirror and say, I helped save the world. And I think that's going to be a very great day. The other thing I want to say is just, I think this problem is so overwhelming, we need to put it into a larger conceptual framework most of the time. And many people turn to religion for that. I'm not a religious person, but I was raised in the Jewish faith. In the Hebrew Bible, it's reported that God said, behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life, so that you and your children can live. That is the choice before all of humanity today. And so let us pursue this activity also with that in mind. And let us choose life. Let us act wisely and with courage and determination. And let's save the world so that our children can live. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Helfand. That was really in-depth and very challenging, but also hopeful. So yes, it was a wonderful presentation. So in a moment, I'm going to take a stack of people with questions, but before I do that, and so you can be thinking about what your question might be and whether you want to raise your hand, I wanted to say something that would buttress what Dr. Helfand covered in the beginning, near the beginning of his speech, which was the utter devastation that the use of nuclear weapons, any use of nuclear weapons, would have. And that is that in the fairly recent past, a new book came out called Nuclear War, a Scenario. It was written by Annie Jacobson, a New York Times best-selling author. And it's not happy bedtime reading, but it gives you a lot more of the detail that Dr. Helfand was referencing of what happens in a scenario where nuclear weapons do start to get used. And in her, just to fast forward to the end of it, it ends up with the 6 billion people dead, the worst case scenario. So basically, once nuclear weapons start to get used, there's not a straightforward way to stop them from escalating. Once one gets used, then inevitably more are going to get used. So there's no, trigger lock. There's nothing to really stop that. And so I think we need to take that to heart, and we're certainly committed as an organization That's one of our founding goals to the global abolition of nuclear weapons. As Dr. Helfand said, we were very privileged to be part of those major nuclear reductions and the organizing that we did. And so we know that that makes a difference. You know, we've done the tactics. We've done the council, city and county council resolutions, the referenda. We've done the petition drives. We've done the lobby visits. We've done the mass demonstrations like in New York, June 12, 1982, when 1 million people turned out in the largest demonstration in U.S. history, 1 million strong. So we know that this challenge, and it's a very daunting challenge, it's doable though. It is doable. We've already created a successful narrative in our not too distant past, as Dr. Helfand said. So I hope you'll take all that to heart. We do have a copy of Annie Jacobson's book at our office if you want to borrow it, or you can buy it, or probably your library has it. So it's not happy bedtime reading, but I think it drives home in detail what he talked about. Okay, so
a quick endorsement also of that book. It's a fantastic book. It is very readable. It reads like a thriller. You can't put it down. No, seriously. It's incredibly compelling. It's also extremely well researched,
yes,
thoroughly documented. It's a terrific book, and you should read it and you should give it to your friends. It can have a huge impact. It also, we believe, is going to be made into a movie, which will be fantastic if that's true. Hollywood Studio has optioned it, and Denis Villeneuve, the director who made the Dune movies and Blade Runner movies, makes big blockbuster hits, has been designated to make this. So if it does get made, it should reach a very large audience. But in the meantime, the book is just really powerful.
Thanks for your talk. It's great, even though it's never comforting to hear about these things. But
Peter, would you stand up so we can...
stand up.
Yeah.
Sure. What do you think about Donald Trump's expressed desire to reduce the nuclear arsenals? He's talked about cutting them back 50% with us and the Russians, that kind of thing. Do you think that's realistic? That could actually happen, and he's serious about that?
It could happen. I don't know if he's serious or not. I don't think he knows if he's serious or not. And and frankly, that's the problem. He has said in recent weeks some very significant things about nuclear reductions. He did a presser in the Oval Office in which he said we can destroy the world 50 to 100 times over. Mm-hmm. We need to have fewer nuclear weapons, not more. We need to cut the defense budget by 50%. Any one of us could have written that part of the talk for him. The problem is that his current budget that he submitted calls for more spending in the military. Yeah. The 2025 plan, which he's following on everything else, calls for more nuclear weapons and the resumption of nuclear testing. So who knows what he's going to do? And it's a problem. I mean, I think the one way that we can use what he said is that we can now approach Republicans who have been quite rare in their support of, say, the Back from the Brink campaign, and we can approach Republicans in office and say, look, the president says this, and this should not be a partisan issue. Historically, it has not been in the past. In the recent past, unfortunately, it is in danger of becoming a partisan issue, given the hyperpolarization. And so we can use his words, at least in that regard, but we certainly can't rely on them, I don't think, to lead to anything good. If it happens, it's great, but yeah. Who had question number 2?
I'll take.
Okay.
So just to add one quick thing to that before we get to number 2. So remember in his first term, then President Trump said, I'm going to get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. They're going to go down to 0 nuclear weapons. No, he didn't say I'm going to have it happen tomorrow like he said on a lot of other things. And he did have, to his credit, 3 negotiating sessions with the top leader in North Korea, Kim Jong-un. In the end, he wasn't an effective negotiator. So even if it was a visionary thing, he didn't have the right people doing the negotiating. And so no progress was made, and not a single North Korean nuclear weapon was stopped. And so that's not a hopeful thing. Now, questioner number 2. Who was that? Right here.
Thank you very much. It was excellent illustration of the disaster waiting. I would like to ask you this very controversial question. Since the ownership of the nuclear weapon gives a power, especially in the Middle East. And since many ministers of the Israeli ministry, they have said the use of the nuclear weapon, even in Gaza, that is very stupid because the Gaza is sitting next to them, and several cities are in Iran. How do we discourage the countries who do not have the nuclear weapon, and also they would like to get power? How do we approach this problem?
I think the only way we can convince countries that have nuclear weapons not to have them is to actively be working to get rid of the weapons that the countries that do have them possess. You know, the hypocrisy behind the current situation, where 9 countries say they absolutely must have nuclear weapons, and tell the rest of the world you absolutely don't need them and shouldn't have them, it just doesn't work. And I don't think we're going to make progress keeping other countries from developing these weapons in the future unless they see tangible progress towards the elimination of the weapons that already exist. There's a very strong movement at this moment, a strong push towards further proliferation, largely because of the way Trump has abandoned Ukraine.
Right.
But the South Koreans are talking openly about nuclear weapons, as are the Poles. There's less open discussion in Germany and in Japan even about possessing nuclear weapons. If Iran does develop nuclear weapons, the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Turks have all said they will develop nuclear weapons too. So there's a real danger that there will be further proliferation. And the only way that's going to be stopped is if the countries that have nuclear weapons agree to give them up and actually are working in that direction. You know, at the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty meetings, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is attacked all the time as undermining that treaty. That's not what's undermining the NPT. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is being undermined by the behavior of the countries which have nuclear weapons and fail over and over and over again to meet their legally binding obligations under that treaty's Article 6 to actively pursue the elimination of their arsenals, which they're not doing.
Questioner number 3?
Thank you very much for all the information. I'm a civil structural engineer, and 20 years ago I worked on a project. It was part of nuclear disarmament treaty, where US and Russia, they were going to destroy the warheads.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they were going to do it, mix it with the uranium and make a reactor fuel, nuclear power reactor fuel. That again, we are on the same line, so we'll be building, more nuclear power plants, which they have problem of their own. What do you do with the spent fuel? Nobody knows yet. So is there any other way where we could destroy the warheads without obviously using them? Is there any technology or?
Yeah, there are partial solutions, I think is the best way to frame the answer. The warheads can be dismantled. The fissile material in the warheads, the highly enriched uranium or the plutonium, can be separated apart so that it is no longer in a configuration where it can undergo a nuclear explosion. There then remains the problem of what do you do with this material? And there are a number of solutions that have been put forward. The mixed oxide solution, where it's used to power nuclear power plants, is one. It is another solution that's been put forward is that the material would be encased in ceramic, basically broken into little tiny pieces, and then encased in glass or some other glass-like substance so that it cannot migrate into the environment and so that it cannot re-aggregate into a warhead-capable configuration. But these are partial solutions because we still have the problem of what do we do with this stuff forever. And I think that the answer to that is we don't know yet. And it's one of the horrible, I'm looking to Zia to see if you have an answer to this, Zia. It's one of the horrible legacies of the nuclear weapons era. Even if we get rid of the weapons by dismantling them, we have created this terrible radioactive legacy that will haunt future generations for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But at least we can dismantle the warheads so they can't explode.
And just to, not to embarrass anybody, but Professor Frank von Hippel back there was on the Science Advisors Committee for President Clinton. And he did work on this very issue of the blending so that it couldn't be turned back into a nuclear weapon. So if you want more detail, maybe corner Professor von Hippel at the end. Okay, so you were number 3, right? So are we up to 4? Yes.
I have a lot of questions, so I'm trying to put it all into one question.
Will you stand up?
Which,
Thank you.
so I'll try to put it into one question. I'm not sure it will make a lot of sense, but I'll try. I plead ignorance. This is the first time I'm in any kind of lecture about the issue. For the past 20 years, I've been more concerned with the environment and climate change than with nuclear danger. I'm at everybody's age here, but I belong, in terms of the ignorance, to the young generation, which you said are horribly ignorant about the issue. So part of my question is, how do you bring the issue to the younger generation and make them realize that climate change is, at the very least, as significant as the nuclear threat, which I think is really crucial because you've got to engage the younger generation, the way I see it. It's everybody, who knows when everybody's going to die tomorrow. And are you doing anything to do that, to engage the younger people? There's a lot more, but this would be enough.
I mean, the need to engage young people in this is a theme that comes up whenever there's a conversation about this issue. We look around the room and we see a lot of gray hair. We don't see a lot of young kids. I'll come back to the gray hair question in a minute. There's nothing wrong with having gray hair and being involved in this. We need to figure out how to reach young people, and they...
Just add to that, I'm so sorry, but it's really important. I think what you mentioned about the movie, that book, and maybe there will be a movie. Just listening to you, I think Steven Spielberg will create a movie if you approach him and present your presentation. I'm terribly serious about it. I'm not joking.
Well, from your lips to Spielberg's ears.
Yeah, amen.
I will tell you. No, I think you're absolutely right.
It's a way to reach young people. And it's not a documentary, because documentary, it's our age group that would, and my son. But everybody else, forget about it. But a movie, with Spielberg.
We've been trying for about 15 years, maybe more than that. Yeah, it is. It's closer to 20 years to get Hollywood to make a movie like The Day After, without success. So I'm really excited that they do want to make a movie out of Annie Jacobson's book, and I think it represents a real sea change in their thinking about nuclear weapons, and it's very encouraging. But we need to do more than we need to get more than that. There are a couple of really terrific screenplays that have been written, that have been turned down by the studios. I'm hoping that they will reevaluate those decisions in view of hopefully the big success that we will see for the movie made out of Annie's book. You've hit exactly, I think, the right note here. We're not going to reach young people with lectures, and we're not going to reach them probably with books. We're going to reach them through the popular culture, through social media, through movies, things of that sort. And so, yes, we're trying to work on all those things. The Back from the Brink campaign received a very generous grant from the Carnegie Corporation last year to create a communications team, which has just been pulled together over the last few months and is now producing social media material for Instagram and for X and for Facebook and all the platforms that young people use to get their information. But we have now the student organization, and one of their key goals is further education amongst young people, spreading the word on their campuses. There's a long ways to go here, but things can happen very quickly. The Freeze movement was built in about 4 years, and we didn't have social media or the internet then. So we have tools that make the possibility of getting this information out quickly, a much greater likelihood. But that's exactly where we need to be focusing.
Questioner, oh, let's get to the rest of them and then I'll.
Same lines that I work with the young people also. Majority of them, they don't read, so what she was
Yep.
saying about the movie, short movie, maybe 15, 20 minutes, and that will get their attention.
Good. Thank you. So to questioner number 5, we're up to, who was that? Oh, Kip. Kip.
So my question relates to strategy with Congress, but also with the public in terms of abolition versus getting rid of one leg of the stool, the Sentinel program. What is your thinking about that as to how to be most effective?
I think we need to win the argument about deterrence if we're going to see any progress at all. There's a seductiveness, I guess, of the idea that maybe if we could take intermediate steps and get where we're going to. We don't have a very good track record on that. We've tried a number of intermediate steps over the last 15 years and have not been successful really ever. And I think the reason is because as long as people believe that nuclear weapons make us safe, any effort to decrease the arsenal, to even just to take them off hair trigger alert or to adopt a no first use policy is portrayed as weakening deterrence and gets defeated on those grounds. I think we need to win the fundamental argument. We need to convince people that nuclear weapons are a threat to our survival, not something which makes us safe, and we need to get rid of them. In that context, I think we will probably be able to achieve a number of quick intermediate steps as the negotiations to eliminate the arsenal completely proceed. The Back from the Brink campaign's central call is for the United States to enter into negotiations with the other 8 countries that have nuclear weapons to work out an arrangement for verification, for enforcement, and a specific timetable for eliminating their arsenals so they can all join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's our belief that none of them will do it unilaterally. They all have to do it together. And I think that's where we need to put our effort on convincing, on helping people understand the absolute need to abolish these weapons. The intermediate steps will, I think, follow.
Thank you. Questioner number 6, who was that? Okay, Ed.
Hello, Dr. Helfand. Thank you so much for enlightening us once again. Whenever I hear you or your message, I feel like saying amen.
We're in a church too, so you're allowed to say it.
Something I rarely say, to be truthful, but I would say amen to that. But the other thing I want to point out is we have here, I don't know where he is at the moment, Christian Morsink.
He's in the front row, right up here.
Oh, okay.
Right in the front row.
Raise your hand, raise your hand. He is the president of our chapter of the UN Association of Greater Philadelphia. And so I just wanted to point out that in terms of the other half of the existential crisis, right? Bob has pointed out that, and many others have, that we have a twin existential crisis in the world. Nuclear is obviously one, and that could be a very sudden one. Climate is getting faster and faster, but it's a more extended one. And on Earth Day this year, April 22nd, the UN Association and CFPA, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, numerous groups are sponsoring a Zoom, which will be easier for people who can't be here today to attend, on that exact question of the twin existential threats. So I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but thank you again. As whenever I see you, I learn a lot.
Well, thanks, Ed. And commenting back on that, it also speaks to the question that you raised about how do we reach young people, because there are huge numbers of young people who understand the concept of an existential threat. They're very concerned about the climate crisis. And what we find when we talk to young people about nuclear war is they very quickly get it, that there is a second existential threat that likewise requires their deep involvement in finding a solution. So it helps to create the conditions in which I think young people can respond very easily to this information when it's presented to them, because they're already thinking along those lines. And especially when we help them understand how connected these two are. If there's a nuclear war, the way most of us are going to die is because of abrupt climate disruption. As the climate crisis progresses, it increases the chance of there being a nuclear war. Now, Bill McKibben, who was sort of one of the really great leaders of the climate movement, has said that he thinks the way the climate crisis is going to do us all in is by triggering a nuclear conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's
Amen again.
and I think that's a message that we can, young people who understand that there's a climate crisis, something that they can grasp pretty readily.
Great. Questioner number 7? Who was that?
Go ahead, Al. Thanks for a fairly depressing talk.
My pleasure.
Yeah, he made his afternoon.
The United States now has embarked on a program to modernize its nuclear arsenal. I wonder if you could say a few words about that, what's going on, how much it's going to cost, and is it, what's its status, current status? I think it's pointing in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean, the few words I would offer are it's bad. This is actually a legacy of the Obama administration. This campaign, this was launched by Obama largely in order to get Republican Senate support for the New START treaty. He pledged that he would modernize all 3 legs of the nuclear triad, the land-based missiles, the sea-based missiles, and the air-based missiles. And the plan called for us to spend what is now calculated something in the order of $1.7 to $2 trillion over the next 30 years, modernizing every nuclear weapon system we have. The argument that is made is that the weapons that we have, like B-52 bombers, are very, very old and they're not reliable anymore and they need to be replaced. The effect of this, though, is to essentially, if we pursue this, lock in place a nuclear arsenal for the next 70 years, stimulate the rest of the world also to engage in the modernization of their arsenals. And in fairness, they didn't need a lot of stimulus. The Russians were already doing this, the Chinese were already doing this, but it helps to perpetuate that cycle of arms racing. There is not effective opposition at this point. There are people who are opposed. The Sentinel missile in particular, which is meant to replace the land-based leg of the triad, the Minuteman missiles, there's a lot of opposition to this because it's just spectacularly overcost already. And because of all the nuclear weapon systems, land-based missiles make the least sense, even if you enter into their weird world of nuclear war games. But it doesn't look like it's going to get stopped anyway. It will be a focus of contention when it comes up for votes, but I don't think the votes are going to be there to stop that program. So again, I don't think we're going to make significant progress in halting the arms race through the budgetary process. It is worth pointing out this obscene waste of resources, because that does motivate people to be even more upset about this. But I think we're not going to really stop this until we get people to understand that we need to get rid of the weapons. Bottom line.
Thank you. All right, so Christian.
Hi, yes, I had a question about the fact that this actually is an international dialogue. And I was there in The Hague demonstrating in 1982. It was the largest demonstration in the Netherlands on the same topic. My question is, there are 9 of these countries talking about this stuff, not signing up on it. What is the movement going on in Britain, in France, trying to get those countries to sign up to this particular UN event and trying to get to that point?
I mean, I think that, the unhappy truth is that there's not a strong movement in any of the nuclear armed states. There's no movement at all in Russia, China, North Korea, very little in Pakistan. There's a significant movement in India, but it's maybe comparable to the movement we have in this country. In the UK, there's a very strong tradition through the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament of opposition to nuclear weapons, and there is some significant opposition there, and to a lesser degree in France. I think while it's important to encourage this kind of activity any place that it exists in any of the nuclear weapon states, the responsibility really does fall on us here in the United States, because this process is going to have to be driven by either the United States, Russia, or China. In the 80s, it wasn't the United States. It was the Soviet Union, really, that drove the process. But I don't see that kind of leadership coming out of Putin. It's possible Xi would sort of figure this out and decide this is what he wants to do. But we're not seeing that at this point. And he's been in power for long enough that if he were inclined to move in this direction, he should have already. And so I think it really is going to be up to the United States, and probably under a different president. So what we need to do is to create the kind of movement that makes it possible and necessary for the next president to make this the centerpiece of his or her administration.
So it doesn't make sense to talk to our friends in other countries?
No.
But more important to talk to our younger people here.
Well, it absolutely makes sense to talk to our friends everywhere, but I think that the critical work is going to have to be done here in the United States.
Thank you so much for the Pearson lecture, and honestly thank you everyone for being here, because while it is such a disturbing topic, it's very comforting to be among people who have the same beliefs and values. I guess my question from, well, as maybe a member of the young people that we're talking about,
Yes.
Whenever I try to talk to my friends about nuclear weapons and honestly about other topics, like for example dismantling dictatorships in some of our countries, the most common response that I get is, well, we're just a tiny small person, nobody would listen to us. And again, especially if you grew up under the same president for 25 years. So I guess, do you have any other means of how to respond to that? Because sometimes I also kind of want to give up. Like, I know I will not, but I get tired of not seeing the results. So I can't really promise it to other people whom I'm trying to convince to join. So how would you do that?
Well, I think you've identified a very important problem. There is this sense, I tried to speak to it a little bit before, of our personal lack of agency. What can one person do about this? And I think it is important to cut ourselves a little bit of slack here and understand none of us is going to do this alone. We have to do this in community. And the Back from the Brink campaign, that's our tagline, Back from the Brink, bringing communities together to prevent nuclear war. I think each of us needs to sort of identify what communities we belong to that we can work in. And faith communities are probably the most common vehicle that people are using at this point. They're natural congregations of people who share values and often are very concerned about peace issues in general. And so that's a particularly useful place to start talking. I think we also need to demonstrate some rapid progress to deal with this question of getting discouraged. And I hope we'll be able to do that. I mean, personally, I am very encouraged by the progress we have made. I don't think we're able to demonstrate that broadly enough yet. And so that's going to be a key focus of this. But I think the real question is figuring out how to work in community with other people, what groups you can work with. So Back from the Brink, by the way, we do have membership, we have space for individuals to join, but the building block of the campaign are communities, organizations, or faith communities, or labor unions, or student groups. And what we encourage people to do is to look into the communities that they already belong to and see where there's room to reach out to people and involve them.
Let me just add to that a minute. Just a few quick additions, and we're part of Back from the Brink, right, by the way, the Coalition for Peace Action. So it's important to have a mechanism for all these groups to be able to coordinate and work together. But I wanted to tell you something that's happened to me just since Inauguration Day of this year. And I think many of us felt overwhelmed and very sort of despondent and even very discouraged and pessimistic. And I want to tell you personally when that started to reverse for me. It started 2 weeks ago yesterday when I went to my first demonstration at a Tesla car dealer. And 400 people showed up. Hallelujah, 400 people. And it was heartening. I mean, there were 5 counter-protesters there. They were a nuisance, but I felt lifted up by that camaraderie, by that sense of solidarity. The second one that gave me a much bigger boost just happened yesterday. Yes, with the hands-off demonstration. And we had 2,000 people show up. I know, Zia, you were there. 2,000 people showed up at Heinz Plaza. It was a fantastic gathering, and I think there was great spirit there, and I feel like we're finally getting some real organized pushback against this Trump-Musk dictatorship, is what I call it. And I think that's a very hopeful sign. So I think we need to sometimes we have to do things intersectionally. You know what I'm saying? So it doesn't all have to be focused on the nuclear issue alone. But as we get into those, we bring in the nuclear issue. And so I just wanted to add that too. Who's next now? Okay, Ed.
Just some quick comments before I get out and move my Tesla.
Oh, okay.
I know, I have one.
You're not the only Tesla owner here.
I think it's for young people, or even a lot of us, we hear about the modernization of nuclear weapons, and we hear about tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons, and we sort of get this idea that, oh, maybe they won't be so bad. Maybe you can just launch a little nuclear weapon and knock out the Gaza Strip or something like that. And I think that's very, very confusing. We need a lot more education. Number two, you asked the question about the modernization of America's nuclear weapons. The New York Times has been very good, and they've had a whole team working on this. I brought in an article, this is from Sunday, October 13, a while ago, The Staggering Cost of America's Nuclear Gamble, and it's a 4-page article in the New York Times. You can find all this information, and it is mind-boggling. The expense, the ineptitude, the delays, it's just to think that we're doing this silently behind everything else that's going on with the tearing apart all the good programs in the United States. They're hiring tens of thousands of people to build nuclear weapons all over the country. So I just call your attention to that. My final point is, I think that like the situation with nuclear power plants, we needed some terrible accidents to focus our minds on what they really involve. We needed 3 Mile Island. We needed Chernobyl. We needed Fukushima. And I hate to say it, but I think we need some kind of nuclear accident with a nuclear weapon to sort of focus the world's attention on what's really going on all around us.
Well, it may take the use of a nuclear weapon to galvanize the world enough to get rid of them all, but our job is to try to make sure that we do this before that happens, for just the reason that you suggested, that it's not realistic to think that there'll be a limited accident. If a nuclear weapon is used any place, it dramatically increases the chance of the full-scale nuclear war that I was talking about before taking place. You know, when the U.S. has done war games on possible conflicts between the United States, NATO on the one side, Russia, previously the Soviet Union on the other, essentially whenever a tactical nuclear weapon has been introduced into that conflict, it has escalated to all-out nuclear war. In the current situation in Ukraine, things are a little bit different because the Ukrainians don't have nuclear weapons, and it is conceivable that the Russians might use a nuclear weapon and it not lead to an all-out nuclear war. But I sure would not want to take that risk and find out. You know, we need to do this before.
Okay, so I know, Peter, you're the last question, but I'm going to get Zia first. Go ahead, Zia.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Ira. Since folks have mentioned the New York Times series, I just wanted to let you know that the editor of that series, Kathleen Kingsbury, is going to be speaking at Princeton on Wednesday at 4:30 in Robertson Hall. She's going to be in conversation with me as part of marking the 50th anniversary of the program that Frank founded in 1974. So that's Wednesday, and it's a public event, so all of you are welcome. 4:30 in the afternoon in Robertson Hall, Bowl 16. You can find the information on the Princeton website. So that's Wednesday. She's going to talk about nuclear weapons and democracy in the United States.
Yeah, well,
No.
No,
it's
is it?
going to be in person. And the day before, on Tuesday, also marking the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Princeton program, we're going to have a special event to launch Frank von Hippel's memoirs. And so that's at 4:30 on Tuesday, also in Robertson Hall, and you can find the information on that. It's a public event, and you're all welcome.
So Zia, as many of you may know, is the co-chair of the scientific advisory group that is helping the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons advance its work.
Yes, Zia.
Has played a huge role in the success of that treaty so far. Thanks for mentioning that. Zia, the series in the Times, At the Brink, I think was an enormously useful and important thing, and a real departure for the Times, which had really ignored this issue previously. The only weakness, I think, of that, and maybe it's something you can correct when you meet with her, is that it never talks about the solutions. And in fact, it is said at times, it has said things like, of course, one can't imagine an anti-nuclear movement in the U.S. today. We wrote back a letter saying, well, not only can you imagine it, there is one. They didn't print that letter. And it would really be a huge service if that series stopped being so pessimistic about the possibility, especially given that this is talking about the role of nuclear weapons in democracy. There has been a significant movement, and it's not just back from the brink, although that's been probably the most prominent grassroots movement. It would be great if the Times actually highlighted those and drew some attention to them rather than saying that it's impossible for them to exist. But it's great that you're going to have that session with her.
Okay, the timing's working out great because you're the last question and we're almost up to 4:30. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, this is a very long question. Real quick one. I understand that getting rid of nuclear waste is a problem from nuclear reactors and from old weapons. And I also understand that fusion as a possible energy source might become feasible in another decade or two, who knows. I've also heard that some of this radioactive waste maybe could be disposed of in fusion reactors. Do you know anything about that?
Nope. I don't, sorry. I think that the pursuit of different new fission and fusion technologies is really a huge diversion. We don't have time for that kind of stuff. We really need to be addressing the climate crisis now, and we have the solution. We know what it is. We should stop spending, really diverting enormous amounts of money into nuclear that will give us much quicker and larger returns if we put it into solar and wind and battery storage and so on. I want to say, I do want to talk about the gray hair question for just a second.
Thank you.
We feel recognized now, huh?
Well, Bill McKibben used to be a big campus organizer. He abandoned that work to start Third Act, which is an effort to organize retired people, because he says that retired people have got the time, they have the networks, they have the resources to do a lot of work, and also they vote in much higher numbers than young people do. The metaphor that gets used often is that the gray hairs like us need to pass the torch to the younger generation. I think it's the wrong metaphor. We need to use our torch to ignite their torch. But we need both torches going forward. We don't get a pass on this, even if the young people do start taking up this issue. We still have energy. We have to work on this. We can't just, say, all right, we've done our job. Our job isn't done until we get rid of the weapons, and I think we can make a huge contribution, those of us who have gray hair still, and just encourage people to bear that in mind and to continue the work that you guys have been doing in many cases, for decades. There's a lot more great, good stuff that you're going to do, and that's really important. Thanks.